Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. The teachings of the Catholic social thought tradition, based in both natural law and revelation, are and always will be timeless. However, their actual influence on secular society, including in the civic realm, waxes and wanes. Sometimes the Catholic worldview has a prominent voice in society. Sometimes it's there, but ignored. And sometimes it's hounded outside of the arena altogether. After a period of what could be described as a coolness, if not outright animosity to Catholic conceptions of morality and the human good, a cultural shift seems to be underway, at least within the United States, that is potentially making society more open, perhaps even more positively disposed to the wisdom of the Catholic social thought tradition. Predictions are always hazardous, and trends can suddenly reverse. But if there is indeed an opportunity for Catholic teachings to have more cultural and political traction now, how should the Church take advantage of it? What practical principles should it advocate for to help society reorient itself to the common good? More specifically, what counsel can the Church give on complex policy issues? Here to discuss the Catholic understanding of the common good and how it is especially relevant in this moment is Bishop Robert Barron. Welcome back to this studio, Bishop.
Thanks, Matt. Always good to be with you.
So today, our topic is reclaiming civic society for the common good, and looking at some potentially practical ways that we might be able to do that on some areas of policy. But before we get into that, what have you been up to recently?
Well, recently, I was at Catholic University of America, my alma mater. I'm on the board of trustees now, and I was able to make us in the first meeting. Given my schedule, it's tough to make all the meetings, but I got there and I really enjoyed it, being back on campus. And it's a very good board, a very active board, lots of good people on it. And while I was there, I had the wonderful opportunity to meet, again, my mentor, my teacher, Monsignor Sokolowski, who taught me a long time ago. And he's still teaching there. I think he just turned 90.
Wow.
And had the great joy of seeing him again, and we had some pictures taken. And he had a big impact on my own life and thinking. Anyone that's read my books or listened to me would hear, in many ways, the dulcet tones of Monsignor Sokolowski. A lot of the themes that I've developed are things I learned from him. So that was a great joy. But just being back in Washington, I got a kick out of that.
Catholic University of America is such a great institution.
Yeah.
It's really a jewel. So as usual, let's lay the table, set the table in terms of talking about the key ideas, especially the common good. So we want to spend some time defining what that specifically means from a Catholic conception. But before we do, let's just confront a very common critique. You've heard it many times before, anytime that as Catholics we begin speaking about the civic realm, and it goes something along these lines. Religious people in general, and Catholics, Christians in particular, have no business talking about anything within the civic arena unless they're willing to leave their religion at the door. So how do we confront that critique up front?
Well, it's just repugnant to our Christianity, and that's because of the nature of God. God is not a being hovering high above somewhere, but God is the sheer act of to be itself, which means whatever exists participates in God. Everything has as its origin and ultimate purpose a God. And so you can't isolate the public realm and say, well, that's somehow not connected to religion. And then go back to our own founders in our country. They understood this principle very well. They weren't coming out of a Catholic framework, but they had enough, I would say, of the classical Christian view to know that especially a democratic society like ours has to be undergirded by certain keen moral and spiritual principles, or it devolves into licentiousness. It devolves into self-absorption and the war of all against all. So Adams knew that. Franklin knew that. Washington knew that. I mean, even Jefferson, who has the strongest things to say maybe about the separation of church and state, I think understood those basic principles. It's only in more recent times that we've exaggerated that to the point where religion becomes a private matter, like a hobby, and then the public life is out there on its own. That's repugnant both to our Christianity because of the way we believe in God, and repugnant, I would say, to the best instincts of a democratic society.
And connected to that, the critique seems to imply or overtly state that religion, and Christianity in particular, is inherently irrational. And so for that reason, since the civic realm is the realm of rationality, therefore
how
we can't
about
participate.
that? Show me the civic realm is always the realm of rationality. But again, to our point, I think on our last show we talked about it, that grace doesn't negate nature. It raises it up, perfects it. And so faith, in the measure that faith becomes irrational, it's no longer real faith, it's superstition. It's now become infra-rational rather than supra-rational. So faith is always inclusive of and perfecting of reason. That's just a caricature that the enemies of religion like to use, that we're irrational, therefore violent. Watch that in the beginning of the Enlightenment, watch it after September 11th. Same argument. There they are again, irrational religious people. All they can do is have recourse to violence. Well, that's, of course, a perversion of authentic religion.
And from a Catholic perspective in particular, when we're making arguments in the civic realm, it's oftentimes on the basis of natural law, which is another way of saying reason.
Right, and that's a way that we've tried to find that common ground with people that don't hold all of our beliefs, regarding the supernatural order, but we find common ground. John Courtney Murray called them articles of peace, that in the basic principles of the natural law, we can find a ground for peaceful coexistence. Now, what's happened, though, and you well know this in more recent decades, is the natural law has been called into question. So once that happens, then we're left with this sort of crazy situation we have, even in our highest judicial articulations, that there's no objective morality, no objective good. It's simply up to each individual to decide what his life even means. And that's an invitation to chaos, right? If you have an ultimate sense of reality completely different than mine, and all we got are these little islands of individual autonomy, civil society breaks apart. So that's the real danger, that if explicit religion is bracketed, but then even the natural law is bracketed, then we just open the door to chaos.
So in the introduction to the show, I note that as you just identified, Catholic social thought principles are grounded in eternal reason. They are the case no matter how they're being received or not received in society. In terms of their actual influence, however, that oftentimes sometimes it's in season, sometimes it's out of season, sometimes it's actively persecuted. So one of the contexts for this particular episode is, are you detecting that maybe there's a cultural shift going on including at the political level, that might be creating an opening for a more positive disposition to the Catholic social thought tradition than before?
Yeah, I hope so. There might be some indications of that in the way we're shifting around politically at the moment. I would hope so. One of the shadow sides of wokeism, again, in its limit cases, would be that sort of just antagonistic view of society. The only category that they have is oppressed or oppressed. You're a hammer, you're a nail. It's a very unnuanced approach to the moral life. And so the excesses of wokeism, I hope, would open people to a reconsideration of this more substantive moral framework. Hope so.
So let's get some more clarity on what the Catholic conception of the common good means. So let's distinguish it, for example, from some common philosophical alternatives in the realm of political philosophy. So one of them is utilitarianism, which its great banner line is the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, some hear that and say, "Oh, that sounds like the common good," but it's different. How is it fundamentally different?
Well, I go back. We mentioned Catholic U. When I was a young kid at Catholic University, Father Russman was a Capuchin priest who taught a moral philosophy to us. He was a classmate, I think, of Archbishop Chaput and Cardinal O'Malley, that era, And he told us the common good is that set of social relations that allow for the full flourishing of each individual in the society. And that's repeated very much in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's foundational for Catholic social teaching. It's setting up those conditions that make possible the full flourishing of the individuals within a society. It's not a crude calculus, so that the utilitarian thing is susceptible to that criticism that, okay, so is it 67%? Is it 51%? Right. And then how do you measure something like the greatest good? You've got to be much more precise. And the common good theorizing does that. So what are the social conditions, for example, that allow for, go back to someone like John Finnis, the basic goods for life, for knowledge, for sociability, for the aesthetical, for the religious. Name the basic goods that apply to every human being. What are the social conditions that allow for that attainment of those goods among the individual of a society. That would be the Catholic sense of the common good.
Utilitarianism also is based on a kind of underlying theory of knowledge that says that we can only use what we can empirically measure as being morally and politically relevant. Is the common good's different in that respect too, right?
Yeah, I think it's just more nuanced. There's something to me very naive about that. That we have these empirical measures and we can use sort of mathematical schemas to determine it. I think it's just very unrealistic. The Catholic common good theory is very nuanced morally. And it has the right balance, too, between the individual and the collective. It's not a collectivism. The focus remains, as it is in Catholic social teaching, on the dignity of the individual, right? So you and I are members of a society, and we hope that the conditions obtain in such a way that you and I can both find respect for our dignity. We can find the goods that are appropriate to us. That's the common good.
So a perfect transition to the next question. How is the common good tradition's recognition of individual human dignity as one of its fundamental categories different from, let's say, in the classical liberal tradition, the recognition of individuality founded on autonomy?
Yeah. Right. That becomes an exaggerated value in modernity of freedom. And see, now we have, as a kind of weird limit case of it, my autonomy decides even what my life means. So now go back to Casey versus Planned Parenthood. It belongs to the nature of liberty to determine the meaning of one's own life and of existence and of the universe. And I'm not making that language up. That's the language of right. Casey versus Planned Parenthood. It's the most insane, lunatic thing ever said by the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm making up the meaning of the universe, So that's autonomy run amok. When you hyper-privilege autonomy, that's what you end up with. Where, what we would look at is the full flourishing of the individual because we're a beloved child of God, destined for eternal life, loved by God into existence. And so we are a subject of these rights and privileges, not of our own determining, but that are objectively the case. And the common good is endeavoring to set up those conditions within the society that make that possible.
The model of autonomy also seems to locate value only specifically within the capacity of autonomy itself, right? The ability to make decisions about one's own life, which means that if you don't have that capacity, you don't have at least full moral value and maybe no moral value at all as an individual. That's completely repugnant.
Well, we've certainly been on that slippery slope, though, haven't we? In debates about whether it's euthanasia, abortion, other things too. That's the kind of reasoning that's being used. Well, look, this poor person doesn't have either some cognitive capacity or some capacity to choose. Therefore, they're expendable. No, we think our dignity is grounded somewhere else. And when you bracket that, I remember years ago when I was studying moral philosophy and, looking at different schools and so on, that just appeared to me as that is the key, that's the fulcrum of all of these things. That if you think human dignity, the dignity of the individual is somehow negotiable, then the road is open to anything. There has to be this non-negotiable, or the system falls apart. And the non-negotiable is the dignity of the individual. Now, where that comes from, a lot of places, it seems to me, certainly in the West, I would say the Bible is the main source of that. I think it is a fundamentally theological intuition. And in debates with atheists, I've used that approach sometimes, is, do you think it's right to, let's say, killing a human being means you'd save 1 million people. Is it right to do? And if you even hesitate at that point, well, then you've got some sense of, no, the dignity of the individual is such that even the greatest possible consequence doesn't justify attacking an individual human being. Well, where's that come from? Now read someone like Tom Holland, who would say, look, it comes from the Bible.
Right.
Is the only right answer ultimately to that. High-level Romans in the ancient world thought it was perfectly fine to expose a child on the hillside if the pater familias decided. Julius Caesar thought it was fine to kill 1 million people while conquering Gaul. What changed? And Holland's answer, famously, is, Christianity happened. So, I would still urge that point. I think there's a theological ground for that sense of the dignity of the individual.
And still looking at from a comparative perspective, how is the common good's insistence on creating a society that benefits everyone, especially including the most vulnerable, How is that different from a progressive wokist conception of social justice?
Yeah, well, the wokest thing to me is based on an antagonistic social theory. It's us against them, oppressor against oppressed. It's a system of original sin without the possibility of salvation. So we're naming this sort of condition you have. You're an oppressor, and there's no way out of it. There's really no reparation that will ever make that better. And then keeping certain people in a permanent victim status. To my mind, that's not anywhere near encouraging the full flourishing and the attainment of good of the individual. I think that's locking us into a deeply antagonistic social theory. Where the Catholic social theory is a cooperative one. It wants everybody ultimately to have a greater access to economic success, to family, to religion, to knowledge, to education. That's the goal. And it's not to characterize the society in such a way that we have antagonistic groups all the time at each other's throats, but rather it's a cooperative social theory. And can we get more and more people the opportunity to avail themselves of these great social goods? I think that's the Catholic approach, which to my mind is much healthier.
One of the terms that you use oftentimes in your sermons, you say fellow sinners.
Yeah.
And every time I hear that, I think just how right that is, and how important that feature of the Catholic anthropology and understanding reality is to recognize that sin is universal. And that oftentimes these political philosophies, including progressivism, will say, there are sin, but it's in this group or in that group.
That's interesting, actually. I think about that more because, yes, one of the great virtues of Catholic social theory is that it's against a sort of utopianism, that we just make the right, changes, we can produce the perfect society. And progressivism in its earlier form was susceptible to that utopian temptation, right?
Yeah, right.
If we just have enough social, economic, political, cultural change. But see, the wokest thing, I haven't quite thought of this way before, is a kind of reversion to, it's not that, it doesn't think society is perfectible, seems to me, that we're just permanently caught in these antagonistic camps. So it's like, it's another type of perversion, not a utopianism. It's again, original sin, but without the hope of salvation. Right? So we're all sinners, and that's a very important thing for social theorists to know. Right? Because it means, that's like, Thomas Sowell has that famous line, isn't about, you can't produce a perfect society. You can address issues and you can ameliorate them. Okay, good. But what's Buckley? Don't immanentize the eschaton.
The eschaton,
right? Because the eschaton it's our earlier conversation, that's something we hope for. That's outside of space and time, ultimately. And if you think, okay, if I elect the right person, I make the right economic adjustments, then we'll produce the eschaton, what happens? Bodies pile up. And we've got tons of evidence of that over the last 150 years, right? People that believe in the perfectibility of the human race are those who produce the most murderous social conditions. Because as Lenin said, not John, but Vladimir in this case, right? Break a few eggs to make an omelet. I mean, so if you want to make the perfect society, well, 1 million or so people or 10 million or so have to die, so be it. Well, of course, that's repugnant. And those who realize we're all sinners, I want them in power. They're much saner people when it comes to social arrangements.
And as a final comparison, how do we distinguish the common good tradition from a kind of generic conservatism in this respect? So the common good tradition embraces what we could call relatively traditional moral and social values. And conservatism seeks to conserve as well, but it seems to be conserving for the sake of conserving. So how would we distinguish sort of that kind of conservatism from the Catholic social thought tradition?
Right. I always distinguish between a kind of Russell Kirk conservatism and a libertarian conservatism. I would subscribe very much to Russell Kirk, that it's a deeply morally informed conservatism and one that's oriented to belief in God. I don't like a sort of libertarian conservatism or almost like a Nietzschean conservatism, where it's my autonomy and don't tell me what to do. And no, it's not that kind of individualism. The dignity and rights and prerogatives of the individual, that's very important, but not an individualism that has no real concern for the common good, and so privileges liberty. You know, I should be able to do what I want. No, Catholic social teaching would say our liberty is circumscribed by moral demand and should be circumscribed by legal constraints when it's appropriate. Because the common good is our focus, not just the expression of my autonomy. So no, I would distance myself from that kind of conservatism.
Is it also fair to say from a Catholic social thought tradition perspective that sometimes it will recognize that social structures do need to be fundamentally changed?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look at the reforms within capitalism. Go back to the time of Marx, mid-19th century, and you understand the sort of prophetic side of Marx as he's bewailing, the social conditions. Look, from let's say late 19th into the first third of the 20th century, and you've got minimum wage requirements, you've got child labor laws, you've got unionization, you've got antitrust legislation. These are all things that were meant to constrain the market. So it's not just this, kind of all-devouring, limitless, contrivance. So yes, who wouldn't favor those things now?
Right.
Who, in fact, wouldn't see the antitrust thing as something very healthy for a market economy? It makes the market economy better.
Right.
It's not eliminating it. It's making it healthier. Or who would be, let's go back to, a kid could work in a factory from, 6 in the morning until midnight. Well, I mean, no one would hold that because that's going to undermine the integrity of a market economy. So sure, those forms of change were, good, helpful for the common good.
And finally, we'll look at just a few policy areas in a moment. But so much of the Catholic social thought tradition and its application depends on correctly understanding the fundamental difference between non-negotiable moral principles on the one hand and prudential judgments on the other. So tell us a little bit about what the relationship between those two is and why it's important to distinguish them.
I find that's often where these things just hit the shoals. Like when people are having these conversations, an example, let's say abortion, euthanasia, where the church would say, you're dealing there with intrinsically evil acts. You cannot directly kill the innocent. That's the characterization of that act. You can't do that, period. And there's no negotiation on that. It's not a matter of compromise or, well, you got your perspective, I got mine. No, they're simply wrong. Slavery, let's put it in the contemporary, context. Slavery is intrinsically evil. It's basically wrong. Torture is intrinsically evil, et cetera. Capital punishment, the church maintains, is intrinsically evil. So those things, there's no negotiation possible. Now, within that basic moral framework, we can disagree like crazy about how best to attain certain moral ends. Let's say, for example, caring for the poor. I'm speaking very abstractly, but should every Catholic be clear that caring for the poor is a morally important thing? Yes, it seems to me. There's no negotiation like, well, you care for the poor. I don't. That's just not my thing.
Yeah.
Well, no. But now, how do you best care for the poor? All of my life, there's been this huge debate, let's say, between those who would say it's through government and social programs, and it's through economic redistribution of the wealth and so on. That's the best way to help the poor. And then call it the Reaganite sort of argument. No, it's by fostering investment and making the economy stronger that in the long run, or think of Jack Kemp, maybe people don't remember him, but called bleeding heart conservatism, because he felt the best way to help the poor, the bleeding heart side, was a conservative social program, to investment, or what do they call them, enterprise zones in cities and all of that. Okay, my point is, that's a matter of prudential judgment. You could have a Democrat Catholic, a Republican Catholic, I'm not saying Democrat, Republican, whatever, and they could have a very good spirited debate about that. What's the best way to help the poor? Fine. And the church should not be interfering in that if you want.
Yeah.
That's a prudential conversation. And, look, I would leave it to economists and social planners and mayors of cities and all that. I don't know. I don't know the best way to help the poor of Chicago. I'm not a social activist. I'm not a politician. I'm not the mayor of Chicago. So that debate can be had, and that's fine. That's fine. So, but if you blur those lines, then you get into trouble, it seems to me, where you start saying, no, things like abortion, that's a matter of prudential judgment. Mm-hmm. No, it's not. Or euthanasia. No, it's not. So anyway, I think a lot of the conversations do get hamstrung because we blur that distinction.
Let's now look at a couple areas that Catholic social thought at a still a relatively high abstract level, but concrete enough to provide real assistance, can speak to. So, Bishop, I want you to imagine that you had all the relevant policymakers listening attentively to you. So, what would you say that the Catholic social thought tradition would advise on some of these areas? So, the first is K through 12 education, or we could even take it up to higher education. What's the fundamental purpose of education? How is that related to both the common good and to parental rights?
Yeah, well, look, go back to John Finnis, let's say, this philosopher of the basic goods. So we want to set up the social conditions that allow for the achievement of these basic goods by everyone in the society. One of the basic goods is knowledge. So knowledge is not just for pragmatic purposes. Knowledge is a basic good of being human. And giving people access to knowledge is a good thing. And the society should organize itself in such a way that the access to knowledge becomes available as widely as possible. There's the principle, Now, how do you do that? Well, that's up to school boards and principals and governors and so on to work that out. But I would put it within a moral framework that we want to educate our kids. In a democratic framework, now look at Thomas Jefferson, would say you can't have a democratic polity without an educated populace. So there it's serving a certain pragmatic purpose to foster democratic society. But I'd put it in a moral framework, first of all. Your point about parents is well taken. Their prerogative to educate their children as they see fit. I know a lot of people today are wrestling, and I get it.
Yeah.
Because not only are the public schools struggling to convey basic like math and science and English and history, but we also have a lot of the wokest stuff, which is, causing a lot of moral dilemmas for parents. So I get that. I know lots and lots of parents who homeschool, and that seems to me is their prerogative.
How would you locate a higher education, particularly within this broad framework that you've established?
Yeah, well, I've been doing research recently on Josef Pieper and the great German Thomist philosopher of the last century, and his famous book Leisure: The Basis of Culture. He would see higher education as, to use Newman's language, as liberal in form, meaning it shouldn't just be pragmatic, knowledge for the sake of a job or for the sake of technology or accomplishing something. That higher education should be geared toward that knowledge which is simply good in itself, that it's sought for its own sake. It's liber because it's free from practicality. And something really goes wrong, he thinks, with us when everything is reduced to the work-a-day mentality. I would say that's a very important thing for the common good, that we have universities and colleges where that kind of education is pursued. Read Newman's idea of a university for the details on this, but I think that's a great social value, that there are people who pursue classical languages and philosophy and the arts and theoretical science because it's simply good to know these things. I'd say that's an important moral framework for it.
How about the economy in a very broad sense? So how does the Catholic common good tradition, how is it different from, on the one hand, a kind of free market laissez-faireism, and on the other hand, a collectivist, socialist distribution of goods?
Right. To me, the best text is John Paul II, Centesimus Annus,
Yes.
right, written on the 100th year. It came out in 1991, the 100th year since Rerum Novarum, which is 1891. But in that text, I think he does the best job of laying out how Catholic social teaching is neither collectivism nor a sort of rapacious individualism. Rather, Catholic social teaching clearly favors the market economy. I avoid the word capitalism as kind of a Marxist way of characterizing it.
Sure.
I like the Catholic social teaching language of the market economy, meaning it's an economic model that corresponds to freedom and dignity. That I have the capacity to start my own business and sell what I want to sell out of concern for a need that I discern in the society. If I'm successful, I'm rewarded for that success and hard work. Entrepreneurship is encouraged. So the market, right? And the idea is to reform the market in such a way, or limit it morally and legally in such a way that more and more people have access to it. We're sinners, as we said. Are there people within the market who use the dynamics of it sometimes so to their own benefit that it undermines the purpose of a market economy? Can it become rapacious and can it become oppressive? Yes. And the church has always said we need to delimit it morally and legally when that is the case. But it's not to undermine it, which is the Marxist solution. I mean, to get rid of the market economy in favor of some kind of collectivist model. The church doesn't like socialism. Go back to Rerum Novarum. It's repeated in every one of the great papal documents. It doesn't like socialism. It likes the market economy, but circumscribed both legally and morally.
And how about immigration, one of the most politically charged issues of our time? What can the common good tradition speak to that issue, to that problem, the complexity of it?
Yeah, and all we can really do, in our time is stay at a pretty high level of abstraction because, again, it's a notoriously thorny problem.
Right.
But some Catholic social teaching would say, and see, I think it's important, Matt, that this is a morally relevant observation, that a nation has a right to define and defend its borders. There are times, I think, and even in our rhetoric in the church, we can give the impression that, open borders is the only right way to do it. Right. What would Jesus do? Well, he'd welcome the stranger, therefore no restrictions. Well, see, that's morally irresponsible for all kinds of reasons. Morally irresponsible in regard to people within a nation state, and yes, in regard to immigrants seeking access. And that'd be another show to go into all the details of why. But it's morally relevant for economic, social, political, cultural reasons for a nation to be able to monitor and maintain its borders. Maybe it's a little bit hackneyed, but the comparison is often, made with a wall and a door. I mean, at night, I close the door of my house and I lock it. I'm very happy to open that door to all kinds of people that want to come in, but, on my terms and with the proper negotiation and so on. Well, I know it's maybe a hackneyed analogy, but there's something right there where a nation has a right to maintain a boundary, but it has a door in it, and it opens that door when it's appropriate. We're a nation of immigrants. All that's true, So the one side is the maintaining of the border. The other is this attitude of generosity, especially to those who are suffering from persecution or in grave danger. Mm-hmm. Think here, Pope Francis, I found this very interesting in our Catholic moral tradition. If someone's trying to break into my house at night, to rob something, well, of course I'm against that. And I'm going to lock the door against them and call the police. Suppose someone is in desperate danger. They're being pursued by an assailant. They're in desperate danger and they're knocking at my door to give them shelter. Well, it'd be morally irresponsible of me to say, no, you're not getting in here.
Right.
So there's that moral nuance. Are there people indeed, in the world who are fleeing desperately terrible situations and are seeking, asylum in a country like ours? Sure, there are. And I think you've got to look at that on a case-by-case basis. And now, the minute we make that move, we're getting into the weeds. And I know you can't adjudicate it in a facile way. And I think that happens a lot on both sides. Whether it's a kind of xenophobic, get the foreigners out of here, or it's a kind of open borders, wouldn't Jesus welcome every single stranger? The right answer is in between there someplace. And Catholic social teaching honors both those principles I was talking about.
Yeah, the foundational principles appear clear there. And finally, there's so many issues we could cover, but we're short on time. The final one we could generically call foreign policy, specifically on how to frame the good of one's own country and a healthy patriotism in relation to the goods of other countries.
Yeah, and sure, Catholic social teaching would affirm a legitimate patriotism, of course, and a love for your country and a desire to defend your country against unjust aggressors and so on. But also, it's a very interesting thing to me, Matt, is I'm an American, born and raised in this country, a proud American. I'm also a Catholic bishop, and I just got back from the synod in Rome, and it's hard to be a Catholic without having this universal sensibility that, especially there, it's so vividly on display, you realize I'm part of this international community, and I couldn't be more different than a lot of these people in the room, but yet we all share this Catholic faith. We've all been drawn together by our love for Jesus Christ and our desire to propagate him to all the nations. And to be honest, my Catholic identity is more important to me than my American identity. If it weren't, I'd have a problem, you know? So there's an internationalism built into the Catholic sensibility, I think. But also bring in Pope Francis here, you know, just as an individual, let's say, who's wealthy, has a certain obligation to those who have no access to wealth to lift them up and to try to bring them into, well, extrapolate from that to the national. Does a wealthier nation have an obligation, not just to enjoy its own wealth, but to offer other people an opportunity to have that wealth or to participate in it? Sure, I think so. Is it okay, you know, for an American president to say, my first obligation is to my own country? Sure, that's his job. I'm the Bishop of Winona, Rochester. That's my first obligation. But I also have an obligation to the national church, you know? So it's somewhere in that balance that we find the right answer.
Well, it's now time for our listener question, Bishop. Now we have Megan from Scranton, Pennsylvania, asking about one of the most common themes in Jesus's preaching, and that's the kingdom of God.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Meg from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And my question is, what is the kingdom of God? Thank you for all you guys are doing. God bless.
Well, it's good. That's a good searching question, because you're right, Matt. It's central to Jesus' preaching. Call it the reign of God in this world. May your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? So Jesus' great prayer that we pray every day. May your manner of ordering things, which obtains in heaven, become the manner in which things are ordered here below. That's the kingdom of God. It would be human life, human affairs, human society ordered according to the mind of Christ. We declare the lordship of Jesus. Jesus is our king. I don't mean that he, you know, sets tax policy in our country. What I mean is he's the ultimate value by which I govern the whole of my life, which includes the political and social order. I think that's what broadly speaking you mean by the kingdom, the reign of God. May God's manner of being obtain here as it does in heaven.
Well, thanks so much, Meg, for giving us that question. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question on a upcoming Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. We really are grateful for your questions and want to hear from you. We are at the end again, Bishop. Thanks for a really enriching conversation.
Yeah,
really enjoyed
that was great. I always enjoy that, man.
Thank you. See you again soon.
All right.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.